Hi and welcome to my true crime channel. Today I'm going to tell you about a really famous Finnish true crime case from the 60s. But before we get into it, I want to quickly introduce myself since this is my first video on this channel. So, hi, my name is Ansu and I've been making true crime videos in Finnish for my Finnish audience. And I've been loving what I've been doing, but I have been kind of secretly wanting to do this in English as well. So if you're interested in more true crime content, I hope you consider subscribing and maybe giving this video a like too, so I can grow this channel faster and keep making content here. So I think an appropriate way to summarize today's case is by saying that you don't always have to be some kind of an evil genius to murder someone and get away with it. Sometimes all you need is a system that allows that to happen. And I'm not trying to be overly critical or shit on my country here, but this is just my opinion about the case that I'm going to tell you about today. So today's case is very famous here in Finland, and it happened in the 60s, and I think it's famous because it started off as a missing persons case, then turned into a murder investigation, and was finally sort of solved well over a decade later. But many people believe that the person who was responsible for the murder got off scot-free, and I think that raises a lot of emotions, especially when you hear about the abuse the victim had to endure throughout her life. So this case happened in Krootila, a village within the municipality of Kokemäki, a small town in the southwest of Finland with a population around 7,000. It was and probably is still very sparsely populated. The town is divided into 69 small villages, so we're literally talking about 100 people per village. I don't know how it is these days, but at least back then in the 60s, most people in the area knew each other and almost everybody knew the Satonen family. The family consisted of Mother Hilkka, Father Pentti, and their 5 children. And it was very well known in the area that life in Satonen family was far from easy. In fact, it was so terrible and unstable that eventually all the 5 children were taken into custody and rehomed either with new families or put to care facilities. In Finland at this time, rehoming children was usually done due to a variety of reasons, usually due to the death of one of the parents, but more often though, children were rehomed due to substance abuse problems, usually alcoholism, or due to domestic violence or both. From what I have understood, the situation within the family was known and documented to be very, very bad because it resulted in all the children being taken away. But unfortunately, even when removed from situations like this, there was no guarantee that the new homes would be any better, and children often suffered from many forms of abuse in both the care facilities and the foster families they ended up with. And in addition, it was not uncommon for foster families to take in children only to serve as free labor or for the additional money they brought in through government benefits. Some of the Satonen family have later told of the abuse they witnessed at home, and according to them, alcohol definitely made their father's already violent temper worse. It was actually really hard to find information about Hilkka's or Pentti's life before they got married or before they got together, but I'll tell you everything that I was able to find. So Hilkka Hillevi Saarinen was born on March 1st in 1927, and according to one of the sources, she had been orphaned as a little girl and grew up with her grandparents. And I honestly don't know what her life was like growing up, but after her grandparents died, she inherited their house in Krootila, which was big enough for a small family. Hilkka knew Pentti Saarinen from a young age, and I'm guessing they grew up in the same village or in the same area. He was 7 years older than her, and at some point they must have fallen in love or something resembling that, because Hilkka was just 20 years old when they got married and began living together in Hilkka's house. I personally believe that they got married just because Hilkka was pregnant, or at least partially because Hilkka was pregnant, as the wedding was held in January 1947, and just 5 months later she gave birth to their oldest son, Seppo. Hilkka went on to give birth to a total of 5 children, and the last child was born in 1953. I don't know exactly when Pentti became violent, but As you probably all know, a genuinely nice and caring man wouldn't become violent overnight, and I think it is kind of commonly believed that domestic violence is something that starts off with something maybe a little bit less severe and escalates over time. But there is conflicting information about this out there. The couple's oldest son, Seppo, has said, and again, he was very young at the time, that he remembers a time in his childhood that was kind of happy, and if there was violence, I guess he didn't see it. This has, however, been disputed by another person that actually lived with Hilkka and Pentti for a short period of time, I think for about half a year in 1949, when Seppo was just 2 years old. Hilkka's house was small enough that you could easily hear what happened in the other rooms, and this tenant said that they often heard what sounded like Pentti beating his wife and Hilkka's desperate pleas for him to stop. They also saw Hilkka often running out of the house, trying to escape Pentti's beatings, and sometimes she was successful, but other times Pentti managed to catch her and would drag her back into the house and continued beating her. I don't know, to me this sounds like one of the most horrible living arrangements there would be, and I cannot imagine that this tenant had a lot of choice. Like, why would they voluntarily live in a situation like that? I didn't really find out whether this person was their relative or why they lived in their house, but they ended up staying for half a year and probably moved out as soon as they could. In Seppo's eyes, everything changed when Pentti took up drinking, and he remembers that alcohol made his father angry and then turned violent towards his mother. Pentti worked as a bricklayer and was known for his strength, so you can just imagine how badly Hilkka got it when Pentti laid his hands on her. So I believe Hilkka and the children lived in a constant state of terror, and I don't really know if he ever laid hands on his children, but even if he didn't, the situation became so bad that in 1958, all the children were taken into custody and rehomed. Later, when the family's neighbors were asked about what they had witnessed, they described Pentti as a cold man who drank excessively and beat his wife for the fun of it. So everybody knew Pentti was beating his wife, and he never really bothered to hide the abuse. And when the neighbors sometimes tried to talk to him about it, he said it was his business if he wanted to discipline his wife. So Pentti was very controlling of Hilkka. He tried to limit where she could go and who she was able to see. And to me, it sounds like he thought of Hilkka as his possession, and he felt he had the right to do with her as he pleased. Hilkka was not allowed to have any money, and the little bit of money she received either through the little work she was able to do or through government benefits, she had to hand all of that money over to her husband. Pentti only ever gave her money if he wanted her to go run some errands, for example, buy some groceries. But even then, he would always calculate the change, and if she was missing any money, he would beat her mercilessly. Over the years, Pentti's resentment towards his wife grew and grew, and in his eyes, she was lazy, she couldn't do anything right, and she was basically a complete failure. I don't think I'm too far off thinking that Pentti must have also blamed her for losing the kids, and I bet he reasoned that if Hilkka had been a better wife to him, she wouldn't anger him so often, and then he wouldn't have to discipline her so much. So the Satonen children have later spoken about a few incidents they witnessed at home. And one of these situations happened when Pentti and Hilkka had gone out to do some shopping, and Hilkka had had the audacity to buy some clothes for her and the children. And this had made Pentti furious. I'm guessing because he wasn't happy that she was using their money to buy something for her and the children, so that this money could not be used for him and the things that he wanted, mainly alcohol. When they got home, Pentti was furious, and he started beating her and threw her all over the house, and in the end even shoved her face into a bucket full of feces and bio-waste. Another time, for some, I don't know what reason, he had grabbed her by the throat and threatened her with an axe. She managed to escape to another room, but Pentti came after her and actually tried to hit her with the axe but missed. He ended up hitting the bedroom table, chopping off a piece, which just tells me that he actually intended to kill Hilkka that time. Like, he literally tried to hit her with an axe, and had she been slower, he would have hit her, probably killing her. After this, he figured he needed another reason to be mad at Hilkka and blamed her for losing a rag that was used to clean his boots. Hilkka, of course, tried to desperately find this rag, but failed to do so, which gave Pentti a chance to discipline his wife a little bit more by beating her with his fists and kicking her while she lay defenseless on the floor. After a while, he told her to get back up, and when she did, he dumped a bucket full of firewood on her and told her to pick it up. And as she was trying to kneel down to do so, he took one of the logs and hit her in the shin with it, and then continued to humiliate her and beat her. And once he was finally satisfied, she was left to pick up the mess, and life continued as normal. Pentti must have taken some degree of pleasure from all of this, from abusing his family, and especially from abusing his wife, because he didn't allow them to have anything that would bring them joy. On the rare occasion that Hilkka or the kids would receive gifts from friends or family members, Pentti always made a point of destroying each gift. On top of this, Pentti kept an axe under the marital bed and would often tell Hilkka that one day he would kill her. And he also added that he was going to do it in such a way that no one would ever find out what happened to her. I honestly cannot even begin to imagine how horrific her life must have been. I think it's so heartbreaking, especially because she was so young when she met this guy, and I bet she felt like she didn't have any choice because she was pregnant. I think at that time it was kind of frowned upon to have a baby outside of wedlock, and I think because she got pregnant, she felt like she didn't have any choice and had to marry Pentti. And I think during their time together, Pentti broke her completely, if not by the repeated assaults, then by making her lose all her kids. So Hilkka lived her life under a constant fear of violence, which of course got worse and worse. And she never really knew when she would receive the next beating. And one time, when Hilkka and Pentti were sat at the kitchen table eating soup for dinner, Pentti took a fork and stabbed her in the arm. According to him, she had been making too much noise eating and called her a pig. Sometimes when Pentti wasn't at home, Hilkka would visit the neighbors to show her most recent wounds and would complain about Pentti's violent behavior. And almost the entire town knew what was going on in their home, but much like one could imagine happening today, no one did or really could do anything about it. Every now and again, Hilkka would run away from home and stayed in care homes, but for some reason, she always ended up leaving these facilities and chose to return back to Pentti, a decision that eventually led to her death. It was December 1960 when Hilkka, now 33 years old, wrote a letter to her oldest son Seppo to invite him over for the Christmas holidays, specifically on the 26th of December. In Finland, we celebrate Christmas on Christmas Eve, and Hilkka knew Seppo would be celebrating Christmas with his new family, but hoped to see her son afterwards on Boxing Day. Seppo was 13 years old at the time and had been very lucky with his foster family, who treated him well. Every now and again, he would travel back to Kroatila to see his biological parents, so Hilkka inviting him over for Christmas was not that unusual. Seppo replied to his mom's letter saying he would love to visit, and they agreed he would bring one of his school friends with him for the trip. In the end, for some reason, I don't know why, the boys ended up coming a day early, arriving on the 25th of December. And as soon as they got to the house, Seppo noticed a few things that seemed off. But at this point, because I know some people only listen to these videos and don't watch the video, I'm going to put the layout of the house on the screen to give you an idea what the house is like. So as you can see here, the front door leads to a small lobby that in Finnish directly translates to wind closet. Basically, it serves to minimize heat loss from opening the front door. From this area, you would enter another small space, a sort of an entrance room where you can hang coats and such. From this area, you could go to two different rooms, a small kitchen through the door on the left and a living room on the right-hand side. All the way in the back of the house were two bedrooms. So when the boys arrived, Pentti was the only one home. The boys were standing in the entrance room and saw that Pentti had been cleaning in the living room, something that Seppo had never seen seen him do before. His mother was the one who did all the cleaning, not his father, of course. And I'm saying of course not because I think women should do all the housework. I'm saying it because I cannot imagine this guy wanting to do anything like that if he could make Hilkka do it. So the living room had a large brick oven on one of the walls, and Seppo noticed that a lot of the stuff that was normally stored on top of the brick oven was actually now scattered all over the floor. And he also noticed that Pentti was clearly surprised to see them. He was actually a bit shaken, and he got up very quickly and came to the door on the right and maneuvered himself in such a way that the boys could no longer see inside the living room. So clearly he wanted to hide something from them. He was acting visibly nervous, asking why the boys had come a day earlier than they were supposed to. Seppo thought that this was all very odd, and he took a closer look at his father. And when he saw his father's hands, his stomach sank. Pentti's fists looked badly injured and were bleeding, which of course made Seppo extremely worried about his mother and asked his father where Hilkka was. I'm not entirely sure what Pentti said at this point because there were two different versions of this. According to one source, Pentti had told him that she left him in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve and hadn't come back. Another version was that Pentti told his son that he had gone out to get some firewood that day and that Hilkka had left while he was out. When Seppo asked his father about his injuries, he said that it had just been a work accident. Well, Seppo and his friend couldn't help but notice Pentti's continuously odd behavior during their stay. First of all, he didn't allow the boys to go to any other room in the house other than the small kitchen and watched their every move. One night when it was a bit cold in the house and the boys got up to get some extra blankets from the back of the house, Pentti, hearing the disturbance, insisted on going with them. And the route to the bedroom took them through the previously off-limits living room. And as it was the darkest time of the year, it was really hard to see in the dark. It was almost impossible to see anything. But Pentti made no effort to light up the living room and claimed that the living room light was broken. So again, clearly he just didn't want anyone to see what was in the living room. Seppo's friend, who was actually supposed to stay for longer, ended up not enjoying the visit at all and stayed only for one night. Seppo, however, stayed until the 1st of January, maybe hoping to see his mom, but unsurprisingly, he didn't hear from her ever again. So Hilkka never came home, and she was eventually reported missing around mid-January 1961, but of course not by her husband, but by their neighbors who hadn't seen her since the 23rd of December. They knew that she had been preparing the house for Christmas and knew how much she had been waiting for her son's visit, and I think this part is so heartbreaking because I don't think that she had much in her life to look forward to. And her son's visit was probably one of the few good things that she had in her life. According to one of the neighbors, she had seen Hilkka going into the nearby woods with an axe on her shoulder and coming back later with a Christmas tree. That day, Hilkka and the neighbor had also gone to a nearby store, and Hilkka had been asking advice on how to make Christmas porridge. So I don't know about your country, but we have a tradition that we have Christmas porridge, this kind of rice porridge for breakfast on Christmas Eve. And it's a tradition, and it's good stuff. You should try it sometimes if you've never had it. But anyway, yeah, so this was the last time the neighbors had seen her before she had disappeared, and that's why she was reported missing. The local police knew about Pentti's repeated assaults against his wife, and as soon as they heard about her disappearance, immediately believed that Pentti had finally killed her. He was actually arrested quickly after the investigation began and was interrogated, but Pentti denied knowing anything about what had happened to Hilkka and stuck to his story that Hilkka had left him on Christmas Eve. He told the police that he had been at work that day, and on his way home he had picked up a bottle of alcohol from a friend. Around 6 in the evening, Pentti had left his house to meet his colleagues at a local bar, and later that same evening, he and his friends decided to continue drinking at one of the guys' house, but they stopped by Pentti's house to get more alcohol, and at this point, one of Pentti's work friends saw Hilkka when he was waiting outside for Pentti to bring the alcohol. That night, they all drank heavily, and Pentti claimed that when he came home at midnight, he went straight to bed. He also said that Hilkka's gray dress, boots, red cardigan, and her coat were missing from the house, making it sound like she had gotten dressed and left on her own accord. Because Hilkka had actually previously left Pentti for prolonged periods of time, the police did think that it was at least possible that she had left him again. I think that's why the police waited to see if Hilkka would return like she always had. But when months went by and she was nowhere to be found, and the town rumor mill was busy coming up with all kinds of theories about how Pentti had killed his wife, the police eventually decided to arrest him. Pentti was interrogated again while the police conducted some searches of the house and the land surrounding it. They were looking for traces of blood and any place in the yard that appeared to have been disturbed recently, but nothing was found, and they eventually had to let Pentti go. As there was nothing that the police felt they could go forward with, the case got cold. The police did interview people over the years, but nothing was found that pushed the case forward. So years went by where Pentti lived alone in his house, well, in Hilkka's house, and Seppo occasionally visited him, all the time wondering what had happened to his mom. He only ever stayed a few nights at a time and spent most of his time going through the house inch by inch, trying to find clues about his mother. And he scoured the yard, he meticulously examined the potato cellar, and he actually even went as far as methodically feeling every floorboard in the house in an attempt to find anything that might be connected to Hilkka's disappearance. I personally believe that as Seppo got older, he began to better understand the kind of relationship his parents had had and the dangers of his father's violent behavior. I bet he often thought back to the Christmas of 1960 and his visit, because he started to believe that his mother had not left as Pentti claimed, but that his father's bloody knuckles and suspicious behavior were strong indicators that something very bad had happened. Seppo didn't find any concrete evidence during his visits to the house, but there were a few things that he noted that aroused his suspicions. First of all, there was a barn next to the house, and on the ground in front of it, there'd been a large pile of sand that had suddenly disappeared. He had no idea where it went or what his father had done with it. Secondly, the brick oven in the living room had been partially dismantled and reassembled. And what was so odd about this to him was that this oven hadn't been used for years, and he couldn't understand why his father had done that. In November 1966, Seppo, who was only 19 at the time, sat down and wrote a letter to the police saying that he believed his father knew much more about his mother's disappearance than he claimed. He wrote everything he could remember about his visit over Christmas in 1960 and mentioned about the brick oven and the missing sand pile. He was hoping that this letter would encourage police to reopen their investigation into his mother's disappearance, and he ended this letter by saying that his father was capable of doing anything. Seppo was actually invited over to the police station to discuss the matter further, but he was mostly asked about whether it was possible that her mother had maybe left willingly or possibly even committed suicide. Pentti was kind of disappointed with this line of questioning and said that he didn't believe so. As the police weren't able to or didn't want to help him, Seppo decided to approach the media and wrote a letter to a magazine called Life. The magazine actually published his letter in 1967 under the title of "I Think My Father is a Murderer." In this letter, Seppo wrote about everything that had happened around his mother's disappearance, but changed the dates and location to preserve some anonymity. Pentti actually got a hold of this magazine, and I think it's so interesting that after reading this article, he immediately called his son Seppo and told him to mind his own business. Well, as I mentioned before, after Hilkka's disappearance, Pentti lived in the house alone, and he kept mostly to himself, but every now and again he ventured into the town center for a night out. And at this point, the entire village knew about Hilkka's disappearance, and because everyone was aware of Pentti's repeated assaults against his wife, it was widely believed that he killed his wife. A Occasionally, a neighbor or an acquaintance would ask Pentti about what happened to Hilkka, and he would respond with predictable anger and violence, often trying to fight the person asking the questions. He was now feared, and most residents wanted nothing to do with him, so I'm guessing at this point he wasn't even that popular among his friends. So Hilkka's disappearance went unsolved until 1972, when the police, who at the time were reviewing unsolved cases, decided to open the case again. They began by going through all the material they had gathered over the years, and that's when they reread the letter 19-year-old Seppo had sent them in 1966. This time, however, they decided to take Seppo's suspicions seriously, and in late November that same year, a group of policemen and a bricklayer went to Pentti's house to dismantle the brick oven in the living room. The brick oven was taken apart carefully from top to bottom, removing one layer of bricks at a time. After removing only 2 layers, they found a large hole that was filled with sand and pieces of broken brick. So I'm guessing this is where the missing sand pile had gone. Surprised by this discovery, they immediately started to excavate the sand, and about 1 meter in, they found what appeared to be human hair. Further in, they found a tip of a boot poking out of the sand, and they continued to remove sand until they uncovered an intact, mummified human body curled into a fetal position. The body was leaning slightly to one side, with knees pulled all the way back to the chest, and the head was bowed down to rest on top of the knees. Looking at the hole, the police suspected that it had been specifically made to hide the body. The size was perfect, and it had been designed in such a way that the body could be put into the hole through the top of the brick oven and then easily filled with sand and built back up. The police suspected, of course, that the body belonged to Hilkka, but they did need someone to come and identify the body. That's why they contacted Seppo and asked him to come over, and he was actually able to recognize the clothing as having belonged to his mother. And he also said that the body was the same size as his mother had been. Seppo was actually later interviewed about how he had reacted to finally finding out about what had happened to his mother, and he said he had mixed feelings about it. He, of course, felt relieved to finally know the truth, but at the same time, he felt sadness and anger, having lost his mother in such a horrible way. After Hilkka was identified, an autopsy was done to try and find out how she had died. As it had been 12 years since she had been hidden inside the oven, the police was unable to determine the exact cause of death. They did, however, narrow it down to a few possibilities. So she could have been either strangled or beaten to death with a blunt object that didn't cause visible damage to the bones, but it was also possible that she was still alive when placed inside the oven and died of suffocation. A horrible, horrible way to die. So unsurprisingly, the situation did not look very good for Pentti. He was a known wife-beater. Everybody already believed that he had killed his wife, and now she was found inside his oven. Pentti was smart though, and he denied having had anything to do with her placement in the oven. When he was arrested and brought in for questioning, he went even as far as claiming that he had never done anything to hurt his wife, and that the police had already actually dismantled the oven in their first investigation in 1961 and had found nothing. Therefore, it was obvious to him that the police had put the body in the oven just to frame him. So the first trial against Pentti was held in January 1973, and this was a huge event for the village. I think a lot of people wanted to go and witness the trial, but only a few people were allowed in. Pentti was confident that he could defend himself just fine and refused legal aid. There actually has been some talk about his infatuation with crime novels, and some people believe that after having read a lot of these books, he felt he didn't need a defense lawyer. I don't know whether this is true, and the court actually didn't allow him to represent himself. Maybe they thought that if he didn't have a lawyer, it could be later a cause for a mistrial and didn't want to risk it. So Pentti was appointed a lawyer, and although Pentti pleaded not guilty and claimed that Hilkka's injuries had always been due to her own clumsiness, his lawyer did note that if and only if he had beaten her wife to death, it would have anyway been just an accidental killing, and as such, it would be classified as manslaughter. This meant that too much time had passed to convict him, and the charges should anyway be dropped. Many people testified against Pentti, including 3 of his children, some neighbors, and doctors who had treated Hilkka's injuries. Although there was plenty of circumstantial evidence, the problem was that the prosecution could not prove how Hilkka died. And I guess this meant that they had to entertain all kinds of possibilities, even the ones that were beneficial to Pentti, like that maybe she had had a heart attack and Pentti, worried he was not going to be believed, hid her body in the oven. As part of the court case, Pentti had to undergo a psychiatric evaluation to determine if he had any mental illness preventing him from being held criminally responsible for his actions. During this assessment, it was actually determined that although Pentti had an average IQ, his ability to comprehend certain matters was weak. In the end, he was considered criminally responsible, and the trial ended mid-June in 1973, and Pentti was found guilty of manslaughter caused by a severe beating. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but in December the same year, the Court of Appeals decided to dismiss all charges, and that was it. He was set free, and he lived his life happily ever after, having done exactly what he had set out to do all those years ago. He was able to kill his wife and get away with it. What I think is so interesting about this case is that although Pentti didn't have a super high IQ and his comprehension skills were really weak, he was still able to beat the system. He got to abuse his wife as much as he wanted and was able to break her so completely that she always came back to him. And in the end, when her body was found inside his oven after the repeated assaults, he suffered no legal consequences and got to live as a free man. I know that some people in Finland believe that Pentti suffered enough because of the publicity of this case and because people were mean to him afterwards. And other people feel that our justice system is the best in the world and this is just an unfortunate thing to have happened. But I, on the other hand, always feel disappointed and sad after learning about these cases and cannot honestly help but feel that Hilkka was failed in so many ways, not only by the police, but also by her community and the justice system as well. I feel like in the end, there was no justice for her and she lived a life that didn't matter to anyone. It's so sad. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments. And for those of you that stuck with me until the end of the video, I really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. And I guess I'll see you in my next video. Bye.